Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the battlefield and into a much quieter part of the Viking world. Not the longships cutting through cold water, and not the raids that usually dominate popular imagination, but the houses where ordinary life actually happened. Because if you really want to understand the Vikings, it helps to begin where they slept, cooked, argued, repaired tools, raised children, and waited out the long northern winters. The surprising thing is that Viking houses were not just shelters. They were carefully organized spaces that reveal how these communities understood family, status, work, religion, and survival. And once you start looking closely, the home tells us as much about the Viking Age as any sword or ship ever could. And before we settle in, if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular viewers do, simply so they don't miss future deep dives into the worlds that shape the past. Now, with that said, let's step inside a Viking house and see what daily life actually looked like. To begin, it helps to clear away one persistent misunderstanding. When many people picture the Vikings, they imagine a people defined almost entirely by movement. Sailing outward, trading abroad, raiding distant coasts, or serving as mercenaries in foreign courts. All of that did happen, and it matters. But most Vikings did not spend most of their lives at sea. Most lived on farms, in small settlements, or in growing market towns across Scandinavia and the wider Norse world during the Viking Age, usually dated from the late 8th century to the mid-11th. Their lives were rooted not in constant adventure, but in routine. And the center of that routine was the house. A Viking house was first and foremost a response to climate, landscape, and limited resources. In Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and the Norse settlements beyond, winters could be long, damp, and punishing. Wind, cold, and darkness shaped the architecture as much as custom did. Houses had to hold warmth, endure weather, and function as homes, workshops, storehouses, and symbols of social standing all at once. This meant that the Viking house was not designed for display in the modern sense. It was designed for endurance. It had to work. The most familiar type of Viking home is what historians and archaeologists often call the longhouse. The name is useful because the shape was usually elongated, sometimes gently curved along the walls, with a broad central room and additional areas for storage, craftwork, or animals depending on region and wealth. From the outside, a longhouse could look low and sturdy, almost merging with the ground in bad weather. It was built to resist the environment rather than dominate it. Timber frames formed the skeleton, while walls might be made from wooden planks, wattle-coated with clay, turf, or combinations of local materials. In places where wood was scarce, builders adapted. In Iceland, for example, turf became especially important, and houses could appear almost grown out of the earth itself. The roof was one of the most important parts of the structure. It needed to shed rain and snow, retain heat, and survive strong winds. Thatch, wooden shingles, birch bark, and turf could all be used depending on what was available locally. The roof often came down low enough to make the building appear even more grounded and enclosed. This was no accident. Viking houses were meant to create protection in a harsh world. The exterior may have seemed simple, but that simplicity concealed a great deal of practical intelligence. Inside, the atmosphere would have been darker than most modern people expect. Windows, if present at all, were small. Glass was rare and expensive, and large openings meant losing precious heat. Most of the light came from the central hearth, from oil lamps, and from whatever daylight could make its way through the entrance or smoke opening. That means the Viking house was a world of shadows, firelight, smoke, wood, wool, and movement. It was not an empty shell with a few pieces of furniture. It was densely lived in. Every part of the interior served some purpose. At the center of many longhouses was the hearth. This was not just where meals were prepared. It was the physical and social heart of the home. Fire provided warmth, light, and the means to cook food, dry clothing, and make the interior habitable during colder months. Around it, daily life arranged itself almost naturally. People sat, worked, spoke, mended, carved, spun, ate, and listened near the fire. The hearth also created a kind of internal geography. The warmest and most desirable spaces were closest to it, and where a person sat could reflect age, authority, status, or function within the household. Smoke from the fire did not vanish neatly through a modern chimney, because Viking houses generally did not have chimneys in that later sense. Smoke escaped through roof openings, vents, doorways, and the natural permeability of the building. As a result, interiors could be smoky, especially during certain weather conditions. This might sound intolerable to a modern listener, but in context it was normal. People adapted to it from childhood, and smoke itself may even have had practical benefits in preserving timbers and discouraging pests. Viking domestic life was not built around comfort in the modern sense. It was built around what was possible. Seating and sleeping arrangements also tell us a lot. Along the walls of many houses were raised benches or platforms. During the day, these could be used for sitting, working, sorting tools or textiles, and receiving visitors. At night, they became sleeping spaces. Bedding might include furs, woolen blankets, and stuffed materials that offered some insulation from the cold. Privacy, as we think of it now, was limited. The Viking household was an intensely shared environment. Families slept in close proximity. Servants, laborers, dependents, and in some cases guests might all be part of the same domestic world. The house brought the social order into one enclosed space. That social order could be quite complex. A prosperous chieftain's hall was very different from the house of a modest farmer, even if certain structural principles remained similar. At the highest end, halls could be large and impressive, built not only for residence but for feasting, politics, gift-giving, and the display of authority. These buildings announced power. Their size alone could communicate wealth, influence, and the ability to command labor. A hall was a home, but it was also a statement. It told visitors that the person who lived there stood at the center of a network of obligations and loyalties. More ordinary households, however, were still highly organized and deeply productive. A Viking house was rarely just a place to rest. It was a place of labor. Women spun wool, wove cloth, prepared food, managed stores, and oversaw much of the household economy. Men repaired tools, worked wood, processed materials, and handled tasks tied to farming, fishing, trade, or transport. Children learned by watching and helping. Elderly members of the household remained part of the domestic rhythm as long as they could. Domestic space and economic space were often the same thing. To enter a Viking house was to enter a working unit. Textile production was especially important. In the Viking world, cloth was valuable. It clothed the household, could be traded, and in some contexts functioned almost like a form of wealth. Spinning and weaving were time-consuming, skilled tasks, and they often happened within or near the home. Loom weights found in archaeological sites remind us that the making of fabric was not some minor background activity. It was central to life. The quiet image of a woman working wool by firelight may sound modest, but it belonged to a much larger economy of survival and exchange. Food preparation also structured the house. The Viking diet varied by region and season, but it typically included grains, dairy products, preserved fish, meat when available, root vegetables, and foraged foods. Storage mattered enormously. A household needed to survive not just a single week of bad weather, but entire seasons of scarcity. That meant preserving, drying, smoking, fermenting, and carefully protecting what had been gathered or produced. Barrels, chests, hanging supplies, and storage rooms or adjoining buildings all played a part. The house was therefore linked to barns, byres, sheds, and the wider farmstead. It was the center of a larger domestic landscape. Animals were closer to human life than many people now realize. In some Viking houses or in attached structures, livestock might be sheltered close by, especially in colder environments. This arrangement helped protect valuable animals and could even contribute warmth. It also meant that the boundaries between human and animal space were more flexible than in many modern homes. The smells, sounds, and rhythms of livestock were not distant. They were part of the lived environment. This was not untidiness. It was practicality. The objects inside a Viking house were usually durable, useful, and limited in number compared with the possessions of a modern household. Wooden bowls, iron knives, bone tools, weaving equipment, chests, cauldrons, ceramic or soapstone vessels, and simple personal items formed the texture of daily life. Decoration existed, especially among the wealthy, but most items needed to justify the material and labor used to make them. A good chest might store clothing, valuables, and household goods. A knife was essential. A cauldron mattered. In a world where everything took effort to produce, usefulness was a kind of value in itself. And yet, Viking houses were not merely functional containers. They also carried meaning. The household was the foundation of social identity. Kinship, inheritance, marriage alliances, and property all revolved around it. Law codes from the later Scandinavian world, though written down after the conversion to Christianity and after the classic Viking Age had begun to pass, still preserve a sense of how important the household was in structuring society. One's place in the world was closely tied to one's place in a household, and that household was anchored in a building, in land, and in memory. That memory mattered because houses did not stand apart from belief. Even before the conversion to Christianity, the Norse world was full of rituals, customs, and symbolic practices that linked human life to forces larger than the household itself. Some scholars believe certain posts, thresholds, or areas of the home may have held special significance. The doorway, for instance, was never just a neutral point of entry in pre-modern societies. It could mark the crossing between inside and outside, kin and stranger, order and danger. In a Viking context, the home was where the visible and invisible worlds met in ordinary ways. So when we talk about life inside Viking houses, we are really talking about much more than architecture. We are talking about how Viking society reproduced itself one day at a time through fire, labor, storage, hierarchy, and habit. The house was where children first learned what kind of world they belonged to. It was where stories were told, where winter was endured, where wealth was counted, and where authority was made visible in the simplest of arrangements. Who sat where, who served food, who gave orders, who owned the land beyond the walls. To understand the house is to understand the Viking world at its most intimate. And that intimacy becomes even more revealing when we look beyond the structure itself and ask a more difficult question. What did it actually feel like to live there day after day, season after season, with darkness pressing at the walls, with labor never really finished, and with the outside world always closer than the house could entirely keep out? If we imagine stepping into a Viking house during the colder months, the first thing we would likely notice is the atmosphere. The air would be warm near the hearth but cooler along the edges of the building. Smoke from the fire would drift upward, sometimes lingering before finding its way out through roof openings. The smell of wood smoke would mix with the scent of wool, leather, cooked food, damp timber, and the faint earthy smell of turf walls. For the people living there, this mixture of smells and sounds was simply the background of daily life. Winter shaped much of what happened inside the house. During the warmer seasons, much work took place outdoors in fields, forests, and along the coast. But once winter arrived, the house became the center of activity for longer periods of time. With shorter daylight hours and harsher weather, families spent more time indoors, which meant the interior space had to support many different tasks at once. Tools were repaired, clothing was produced, food stores were checked and rationed carefully, and small craftwork continued by the light of the fire. The rhythm of a winter evening in a Viking house would have been steady and purposeful rather than quiet or idle. One person might be turning a spindle, slowly spinning wool into thread. Another might be sharpening a blade or shaping a wooden tool handle. Someone else might be preparing a simple meal in an iron pot suspended over the hearth. Children might sit nearby learning small tasks, perhaps helping to untangle wool or carry small items from one part of the house to another. Even moments of rest were rarely empty. Hands were usually occupied with something useful. Lighting inside the house was limited, so the hearth served as a natural gathering point. Oil lamps made from simple containers filled with animal fat could provide additional light, but they were still dim compared to modern standards. This meant that evenings tended to gather everyone toward the same central space. The glow of the fire would illuminate faces and tools while the outer edges of the room remained darker. This created a kind of natural closeness within the household, where conversation, work, and storytelling could easily blend together. Storytelling itself was an important part of life inside Viking houses. Long winter nights created time for memory and narrative. People shared stories about family history, local events, journeys, and the deeds of well-known figures. These stories were not only entertainment. They helped pass down knowledge, values, and cultural identity. In a largely oral culture, the spoken word carried weight. The house, warm and enclosed against the cold outside, became the setting where these traditions continued from one generation to the next. Food preparation inside the house followed patterns shaped by preservation and necessity. Fresh food was not always available during winter, so much of the diet depended on stored supplies. Dried fish, salted meat, preserved dairy products, and grains could all be prepared into filling meals. The hearth allowed for boiling, roasting, and slow cooking, often in a single central pot shared by the household. Meals were practical rather than elaborate, but they provided the energy needed for long days of labor. Eating together reinforced the social structure of the household. Seating arrangements often reflected hierarchy. The head of the household, sometimes called the householder or chieftain depending on status, would occupy a respected position along the bench. Family members, workers, and guests would sit according to their place within the household structure. These arrangements might seem subtle, but they reinforced social relationships every single day. Even simple meals quietly reminded everyone of their roles within the community. Sleeping arrangements followed similar patterns. At night, the benches along the walls became sleeping spaces. Bedding made from wool, furs, and simple mattresses helped provide insulation from the cold wooden surfaces. Families slept close together, partly for warmth and partly because space was shared by necessity. In larger households, several people might sleep along the same bench area, separated perhaps by blankets or personal belongings. Privacy was limited, but cooperation and familiarity were part of daily life. Despite the closeness of shared living space, Viking houses were not chaotic. Over time, households developed routines that kept the space organized. Tools had places where they were stored. Food supplies were carefully protected. Valuable items such as metal tools or trade goods might be kept in locked chests. Even though the interior might appear crowded to modern eyes, the people living there understood exactly where things belonged and how the space functioned. Another important feature of life inside Viking houses was the constant awareness of resources. Every item in the house represented time, labor, or skill, would had to be cut and shaped. Iron tools required skilled metalworking. Cloth required many hours of spinning and weaving. Because of this, people treated objects with care. Broken tools were repaired whenever possible. Clothing was patched and reused. Waste was kept to a minimum because materials were too valuable to discard lightly. This careful relationship with resources also influenced how the house itself was maintained. Roofs needed repair after harsh weather. Wooden beams had to remain strong. Walls made from turf or clay might need reinforcement. The household worked together to keep the structure secure because the house was not just shelter. It was the center of survival. A damaged roof or weakened wall could become a serious problem during the colder seasons. Life inside Viking houses therefore balanced cooperation, discipline, and shared responsibility. Everyone within the household had a role, and the functioning of the house depended on those roles being fulfilled. Children gradually learned these responsibilities through observation and participation. By the time they reached adulthood, they understood the rhythms of household life because they had grown up within them. What makes Viking houses particularly fascinating to historians today is how much information they preserve about everyday life. Archaeological discoveries, such as post holes, hearth remains, loom weights, storage pits, and fragments of tools, allow researchers to reconstruct how these spaces were used. Even small details, like the location of a hearth or the arrangement of benches, help scholars understand how Viking families organized their lives inside these buildings. In many ways, the Viking house was more than a building. It was the physical expression of a community's way of life. Inside its walls, survival strategies, traditions, social relationships, and economic activities all came together. The house protected its inhabitants from the harsh northern environment, but it also shaped how they lived, worked, and interacted with one another. And when we begin to see Viking houses in this way, not as simple huts, but as complex centers of daily life, we start to understand something important. The strength of Viking society did not only come from warriors or explorers. It also came from households that functioned efficiently, passed down knowledge, and supported the people who would eventually sail outward into the wider world. Because before a Viking ever stepped onto a ship, before a trader traveled to distant markets, and before a warrior set foot on foreign shores, another detail that becomes clear when studying Viking houses is how closely the home was connected to the surrounding landscape. A Viking house did not stand alone in isolation. It was usually part of a small farmstead that included storage buildings, animal shelters, work areas, and sometimes additional houses for extended family or workers. The main house was the center of this small world, but life constantly moved between indoors and outdoors depending on the season and the work that needed to be done. During the warmer months, the house might feel quieter during the day. Many household members would be outside tending crops, fishing, gathering wood, repairing fences, or caring for animals. The house would still be used for cooking, storage, and rest, but much of the daily activity spread across the wider farm. Then, as evening approached, people gradually returned indoors. Fires were lit, meals were prepared, and the house once again became the center of family life. This daily movement between inside and outside meant that the doorway of a Viking house was an especially active place. It marked the transition between the protected interior and the unpredictable world beyond. People carried tools through it, brought food into the house, stepped outside to check animals or weather, and welcomed guests arriving from nearby farms or distant journeys. Over time, these entrances became worn by constant use, and archaeologists sometimes find traces of heavy foot traffic in the soil around them. Visitors played an important role in Viking social life, and houses were designed with hospitality in mind. Even modest households expected to host travelers from time to time. Scandinavia during the Viking Age was a network of farms and small settlements, and people often relied on the hospitality of others when traveling long distances. Offering shelter and food to a guest was not simply kindness. It was part of a social expectation that helped maintain relationships between communities. When a guest arrived, the atmosphere inside the house could change noticeably. The household might prepare a better meal than usual, and conversation would likely turn toward news from other places. Visitors carried stories about markets, ships, political events, and distant regions. In a world without written newspapers or rapid communication, these conversations were an important source of information. A single traveler might bring news that affected decisions about trade, alliances, or future journeys. In larger houses belonging to wealthy families or local leaders, hospitality could become a more formal event. The central hall might host feasts where food and drink were shared among guests, allies, and members of the household. These gatherings helped strengthen social bonds. A leader who could provide generous hospitality demonstrated wealth and reliability, both of which were important qualities in a society built on personal loyalty and reputation. Feasting inside these halls also reinforced social hierarchy. Seating positions could reflect status, and the distribution of food and drink followed recognizable patterns. The most respected individuals sat in prominent places near the center of activity. While this might appear ceremonial, it was also practical. Viking society relied heavily on visible demonstrations of trust, honor, and leadership. A feast was one of the clearest ways to show these relationships in action. Yet even in these larger gatherings, the house remained fundamentally a domestic space. Children might still move quietly along the walls. Household members continued their responsibilities behind the scenes, preparing food, managing supplies, and maintaining order. The public and private aspects of life blended together within the same structure. Another interesting aspect of Viking houses is how they reflected regional differences across the Norse world. The Viking Age stretched far beyond Scandinavia itself. Norse settlers established communities in places such as Iceland, Greenland, parts of the British Isles, and even briefly in North America. In each of these places, houses adapted to local conditions while still maintaining familiar structural ideas. In Iceland, for example, timber was limited, so builders relied heavily on turf and stone. Walls could be thick and layered with grass-covered earth that provided excellent insulation. From a distance, these houses often appeared low and blended into the landscape. Inside, however, the arrangement of hearth, benches, and working spaces remained similar to houses in mainland Scandinavia. In coastal areas with greater access to timber, wooden structures were more common. The availability of materials influenced everything from roof design to wall construction. This adaptability shows how practical Viking builders were. Rather than following a rigid architectural rule, they used whatever resources the local environment offered. Archaeological discoveries have helped historians understand these houses in remarkable detail. Excavations across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic have uncovered the outlines of longhouses through post holes and foundation remains. By mapping these features carefully, researchers can estimate the size of buildings and reconstruct how rooms were arranged. Objects found within these sites provide even more insight. Loom weights reveal where weaving once took place. Fragments of pottery or cooking vessels mark the location of hearths and food preparation areas. Animal bones help researchers understand what people ate and how livestock were managed. Even small pieces of metal or glass can indicate trade connections with distant regions. These discoveries remind us that Viking houses were active centers of daily life for generations. Each layer of soil may represent years of repairs, rebuilding, and adaptation as families expanded or conditions changed. Sometimes a new house was built directly over the remains of an older one, preserving the location of a family home across many decades. In this way, the Viking house also became a place of memory. Families remained connected to particular farms or settlements for long periods of time. The house stood as a physical reminder of ancestors who had lived and worked in the same place before them. Land, home, and family identity were closely linked. When we imagine life inside Viking houses today, it is easy to focus on the practical details: fires, tools, beds, and meals. But these buildings also carried emotional meaning. They were places where people experienced the most important moments of their lives. Births, marriages, celebrations, conflicts, and losses. The house witnessed all of it. And that quiet, steady role may be one of the most revealing aspects of Viking society. While ships and warriors capture the imagination, the strength of the Viking world rested on something much more ordinary. It rested on houses like these, strong, practical, and filled with the everyday lives of the people who called them home. Because long before the Vikings became famous in distant lands, they were farmers, families, and neighbors gathered around the hearth inside houses built to endure the northern world. As night settled fully across the northern landscape, the Viking house took on a different rhythm. Outside, the world could be dark, quiet, and often cold, especially during the long winters of Scandinavia. But inside the house, the fire continued to burn slowly in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the wooden beams and earthen floor. The interior would grow quieter as the evening tasks were finished, though small movements and quiet conversations still carried through the dimly lit space. The final hours before sleep were often some of the most peaceful moments of the day. After long periods of work, whether farming, crafting, repairing equipment, or preparing food, the household gradually shifted toward rest. People might sit near the hearth, finishing small tasks that required little light. A spindle might still turn slowly in someone's hands, or a knife might be used to carve a small wooden tool. These quiet activities filled the last part of the evening without demanding much energy. Children, who had spent the day helping with chores or playing near the house, would eventually grow tired and settle onto the benches along the walls. Older members of the household sometimes used these quieter moments to speak about family matters, discuss plans for the coming days, or share memories of earlier years. In this way, the Viking house was not only a place of work, but also a place where knowledge and experience were passed down naturally through conversation. The sounds of the house at night were subtle but constant. The fire crackled softly as wood shifted in the hearth. Occasionally someone adjusted bedding or moved quietly across the floor. Outside, the wind might brush against the roof or walls. If animals were kept nearby in connected structures, their movements might also be heard. These sounds formed a familiar nighttime atmosphere that residents would have known well. Sleeping arrangements followed practical patterns shaped by both space and warmth. The benches along the walls were covered with layers of wool blankets, animal furs, or simple mattresses filled with straw or feathers. Families often slept close together, which helped conserve body heat during cold nights. In larger households, several people might share the same sleeping area, each wrapped in their own bedding but resting within the shared warmth of the house. Despite the shared space, people still developed small habits that created a sense of personal order. Some kept their belongings, such as knives, small tools, or clothing, stored in chests near where they slept. Others might hang certain items along the walls or place them carefully beside their bedding. Even within a communal household, individuals maintained small areas of personal responsibility. The fire itself was treated carefully overnight. Completely extinguishing the hearth each evening would make it difficult to restart the next day, especially during cold weather. Instead, the fire was often allowed to burn down slowly into glowing embers. These embers could be stirred back into flame in the morning with fresh wood. Maintaining this small source of heat and light required attention, and someone in the household usually made sure the hearth remained safe but still alive through the night. Morning in a Viking house began early, often shortly after the first light appeared outside. In winter, this might still mean waking in darkness, but daily work could not wait long. The first person awake might move quietly to the hearth, stirring the embers and adding new wood. Gradually, the fire would brighten the room again, and the warmth would begin to spread through the house. As the fire grew stronger, the rest of the household slowly came to life. Bedding was folded or pushed aside along the benches. Tools were gathered, and simple morning meals might be prepared. Porridge made from grains, bread, dairy products, or preserved foods could provide the energy needed for the day ahead. The house filled once more with movement and quiet conversation. Soon afterward, many members of the household stepped outside to begin their daily responsibilities. Farmers checked animals, inspected fences, or prepared fields. Others might travel to nearby settlements, repair equipment, gather firewood, or continue work that had begun the day before. The house remained active as well, with some members staying behind to manage indoor tasks such as cooking, weaving, cleaning, and organizing supplies. Through this repeating cycle of evening rest, nighttime quiet, and early morning activity, the Viking house maintained a steady rhythm that shaped everyday life. It provided shelter from the unpredictable northern climate, but it also created a stable environment where families could work together, share knowledge, and support one another. When historians study these houses today, they often see them as the foundation of Viking society. Long before ships sailed across distant seas or traders reached foreign markets, the strength of Norse communities began within these homes. The routines developed inside the house: cooperation, resourcefulness, and shared responsibility prepared people for the challenges of life beyond their door. In this sense, the Viking house was not just a place where people slept or stored their belongings. It was the center of learning, survival, and community life. The warmth of the hearth, the closeness of family members, and the careful use of limited resources all helped shape the character of the people who lived there. And if we imagine standing quietly inside one of these houses as the morning fire begins to glow again, we might realize something important. The Viking Age, with all its voyages and legends, was built upon thousands of ordinary mornings like this, mornings that began not on the open sea, but inside a wooden house warmed by a simple fire. Over the course of many years, the Viking house also changed as the household itself changed. Families grew, children became adults, new members joined through marriage, and sometimes older generations passed away. These shifts often required adjustments to the home. Additional storage spaces might be created, sections of the house repaired, or nearby buildings constructed to support expanding work and resources. The house was not a static structure. It evolved slowly along with the lives of the people inside it. In some cases, houses were rebuilt entirely after many years of use. Wood could weaken, roofs could sag under years of weather, and walls might begin to settle unevenly into the ground. Rather than abandoning a familiar place, Viking families often rebuilt in nearly the same location. Archaeologists sometimes discover layers of houses built one after another in the same spot, showing that the site of the household remained important across generations. Each new structure carried forward the memory of the previous one. This continuity was especially important in farming communities. Land was valuable, and successful farms represented stability and survival. When a house stood on productive land with access to water, grazing areas, and good soil, families had strong reasons to remain there for many years. The house became part of the identity of the family itself. It represented not only shelter but also inheritance, responsibility, and connection to ancestors who had lived on the same ground. The internal layout of many Viking houses also reveals something about how people balanced shared living with necessary organization. Even though much of the space was communal, subtle divisions existed. Certain areas were clearly meant for working with textiles, while others were used for food preparation or tool storage. In larger houses, partial partitions or side rooms sometimes created smaller spaces for specific activities. These divisions allowed the household to function efficiently even when many tasks were happening at the same time. Craft work was particularly important inside the house during colder seasons. In addition to spinning and weaving, people repaired fishing nets, shaped wooden bowls or handles, worked leather into belts or shoes, and maintained farming tools. These activities required patience and skill. Over the years, knowledge about these crafts passed through families in much the same way that stories and traditions did. Women played a central role in maintaining the daily function of the house. In Norse society, the management of the household was often considered a position of responsibility and authority. The woman responsible for the household oversaw food supplies, textile production, and the general organization of domestic life. Keys, which symbolized control over household storage areas, were sometimes worn as part of personal dress. This detail appears in archaeological findings and suggests that managing the home was both a practical and respected role. Men also contributed significantly to life inside the house, particularly in tasks involving woodworking, tool maintenance, and preparation for agricultural work or travel. However, the responsibilities of men often extended further outside the home as well. Farming, fishing, hunting, and trading could require long hours beyond the walls of the house. Yet even when much of the labor happened outdoors, the house remained the base where supplies were stored, equipment was repaired, and plans were discussed. Children grew up learning these roles gradually. In a Viking household, learning was not separated into formal lessons as it might be today. Instead, children learned by observing adults and participating in small ways. A young child might begin by carrying water, gathering small pieces of firewood, or helping to watch animals. As they grew older, they took on more complex tasks. By adolescence, many young people were already skilled in the work that would support them throughout adulthood. This gradual education ensured that the household always had capable members ready to contribute. Survival in the northern environment depended on cooperation and competence. If everyone understood their responsibilities, the household could function smoothly even during difficult times. The house also served as a place where important decisions were discussed. Matters involving land, trade, or relationships with neighboring families might be talked about around the hearth. These discussions were not always formal meetings, but they helped shape the direction of the household. The people living together needed to agree on plans for planting crops, storing food, managing animals, and responding to challenges such as poor harvests or harsh winters. Occasionally, houses also became temporary gathering places for wider community discussions. In smaller settlements, neighbors might meet inside a larger hall to talk about shared concerns. These conversations could involve trade opportunities, disputes over land boundaries, or plans for collective projects such as repairing local infrastructure or organizing travel routes. While larger legal assemblies known as things were held in open spaces outside settlements, the everyday discussions that maintained cooperation between families often began inside homes. The house therefore supported not only the household itself but also the wider community that depended on mutual trust and communication. Religion and belief also touched everyday life within the Viking house. Before the widespread adoption of Christianity in Scandinavia, Norse spiritual traditions were woven quietly into daily routines. While large temples or sacred outdoor sites existed, small rituals could occur within the home itself. Offerings, spoken blessings, or symbolic objects might mark important moments such as births, seasonal transitions, or successful harvests. These practices connected the household to the wider spiritual worldview of Norse culture. The house was seen as a protected space, but it still existed within a universe believed to be filled with powerful forces, both natural and supernatural. Respect for these forces could be expressed in simple ways within the household environment. Over time, as Christianity spread across Scandinavia during the late Viking Age, some of these traditions gradually changed. Churches appeared in many communities, and Christian symbols began to replace earlier religious practices. Yet the house remained central to daily life regardless of belief. Whether Norse or Christian, families still gathered around the hearth, prepared meals together, and shared the responsibilities of maintaining their homes. Looking back now, the Viking house offers one of the clearest windows into how ordinary people lived during this remarkable historical period. Archaeology may uncover ships, weapons, and treasure, but the quiet remains of houses tell a different story, one about routine, cooperation, and resilience. Within these wooden walls and turf-covered roofs, generations of families experienced the full range of human life. They worked, celebrated, worried, planned, and rested in spaces built by their own hands. The houses protected them from harsh winters and unpredictable weather, but they also shaped the habits and relationships that defined Viking society. And when we imagine the Viking Age today, one of the most interesting aspects of Viking houses is how closely daily life followed the changing seasons. Unlike modern homes, which are designed to maintain a similar lifestyle year-round, the Viking house adapted constantly to the natural rhythm of the environment. The way space was used in summer could feel very different from the way it was used during winter. These seasonal adjustments shaped how families organized their time, labor, and resources. During the spring, activity around the house increased dramatically. After the long, darker months of winter, people moved outdoors again to begin the agricultural cycle. Fields needed to be prepared, animals required attention, and tools that had been repaired indoors during winter were finally put back to use. Inside the house, winter bedding might be cleaned and stored, and food supplies were carefully evaluated to see how much remained from the previous harvest. Spring also brought a renewed sense of movement through the household. Travelers began to appear more frequently on local routes, trade journeys resumed, and families sometimes visited nearby settlements after months of relative isolation. The house served as the starting point for all of this activity. It was where people prepared supplies, discussed plans, and returned each evening after long days of work. Summer created a different atmosphere altogether. Long daylight hours allowed people to work outside for extended periods. Farming, fishing, animal care, and gathering resources from forests or coastlines required much of the household's attention. The interior of the house was still important for cooking, sleeping, and storage, but many daytime tasks happened beyond its walls. Even so, the house remained essential during summer storms or periods of bad weather. Heavy rain or strong winds could quickly drive everyone indoors, where work continued in smaller ways. Tools might be sharpened, nets repaired, or food prepared for later use. These moments remind us that the house was always ready to serve as a reliable center of activity regardless of conditions outside. Autumn was perhaps one of the busiest and most important times of the year inside Viking houses. As temperatures began to drop, families focused on preparing for the coming winter. Harvested crops had to be processed and stored. Meat and fish were preserved through drying, smoking, or salting. Dairy products might be turned into longer-lasting foods. Every household worked carefully to ensure that enough supplies would last through the colder months. Inside the house, storage areas gradually filled with these preserved foods. Barrels, sacks, and containers were arranged carefully so that supplies could be managed over time. The success of these preparations could determine whether a household experienced comfort or hardship during winter. Because of this, autumn work inside the home was approached with seriousness and cooperation. Clothing preparation was also an important autumn task. Wool gathered earlier in the year had to be spun and woven into fabric strong enough to withstand cold weather. Garments were repaired, patched, or replaced as needed. Thick cloaks, gloves, and footwear helped people continue working even when temperatures fell. Much of this textile work took place inside the house, often near the hearth where warmth and light made the tasks easier. As winter returned, the house once again became the central focus of daily life. Darkness arrived earlier each day, and the outside world often grew quiet under snow, frost, or heavy winds. Inside the house, however, life continued with steady routines. The careful planning of previous seasons now revealed its value, as stored food, repaired tools, and warm clothing supported the household through the most difficult part of the year. These seasonal cycles created a strong sense of connection between the Viking house and the natural world. The structure itself protected its inhabitants from harsh weather, but it also reminded them constantly of their dependence on the land and sea. Every wall, roof beam, and hearthstone existed because people had learned how to live within this demanding environment. Another remarkable feature of Viking houses is the sense of durability they conveyed. These buildings were not designed to be temporary shelters. Even when constructed with relatively simple materials, they represented long-term investment. Families expected to live in these homes for many years, and often for multiple generations. Repairs and improvements were made gradually as needed, reinforcing the idea that the house was a lasting foundation for family life. Because of this long-term connection, houses often became deeply familiar spaces filled with memory. Children grew up recognizing every beam and corner of the interior. Adults remembered where certain tools had always been stored or where earlier generations once slept. The house itself became a quiet witness to family history, holding traces of countless everyday moments. Archaeologists sometimes see evidence of these memories in the way houses were rebuilt. Instead of abandoning an old home entirely, families might reconstruct new walls or roofs while maintaining the same basic layout. This continuity suggests that the location of the house carried meaning beyond simple practicality. It represented stability in a world where travel, trade, and seasonal change were constant. In many ways, the Viking house balanced two different realities. On one hand, Viking culture is often remembered for exploration and movement. Ships crossing oceans, traders traveling far beyond Scandinavia, and warriors appearing on distant shores. On the other hand, most people lived stable lives rooted firmly in their homes and farms. The house anchored the society that made those journeys possible. Without these strong households, the larger achievements of the Viking Age would have been far more difficult. Ships required supplies. Expeditions required planning. Trade required goods produced at home. The quiet routines inside Viking houses supported the more visible activities that later became famous in history. So when we imagine life inside a Viking house, we should picture not only a building but an entire system of survival and cooperation. Firelight reflecting on wooden walls, the careful storage of food, the steady work of spinning wool or repairing tools. These ordinary scenes formed the true foundation of Viking society. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. Behind every ship that sailed into the unknown, there was almost always a house somewhere in the north, standing against the wind, its hearth burning quietly while the people inside prepared for whatever the next season would bring. Over time, Viking houses also reflected the changing fortunes of the families who lived within them. A household that experienced successful harvests, profitable trade, or growing influence in the local community might gradually expand or improve its home. Additional storage spaces could be added, stronger beams installed, or new outbuildings constructed nearby. These changes did not happen quickly, but over years and decades the farmstead could slowly grow into a more complex and prosperous place. The size of a house often hinted at the status of the family living there. Larger halls suggested that the household had more resources, more workers, and possibly greater influence in the surrounding region. A well-built hall could host gatherings, feasts, and meetings that strengthened social relationships between families and allies. Visitors arriving from other settlements would immediately notice the scale of such a building. Even before a single word was spoken, the house itself communicated the strength of the household. In contrast, Smaller houses belonged to families whose lives were focused more closely on the daily work of farming and survival. Yet these homes were no less important. Even a modest Viking house required knowledge, planning, and careful construction. The ability to build and maintain a reliable shelter in the northern climate was a skill shared across Viking society. Regardless of wealth or status, every household depended on the strength of its home. Another important feature of Viking houses was their flexibility. Because the interior space was relatively open, it could be adapted for different needs. Benches could serve as seating during the day and beds at night. Work areas could shift depending on what tasks were most important at the time. When guests arrived, the household might rearrange the space slightly to make room for additional people around the hearth. This adaptability made the house suitable for many different moments in life. It could be a quiet family space on an ordinary day, but it could also transform into a gathering place during celebrations or important events. Weddings, seasonal feasts, or the return of travelers might bring extended family and neighbors together inside the same hall. The fire burned brighter, food was shared more generously, and the normally steady rhythm of the household became lively for a time. Music and spoken poetry may also have filled the air during such gatherings. In Norse culture, storytelling and recited verse were valued forms of expression. Skilled storytellers could recount historical events, family histories, or heroic tales that connected listeners to the wider traditions of their culture. Inside the warm hall, with the sound of the wind outside and the glow of the hearth illuminating the room, these stories would have created powerful shared experiences. At other times, the house became a place of quiet reflection. Long winters provided space for thought, conversation, and planning for the future. The household might discuss the coming planting season, possible trade journeys, or alliances with neighboring families. Because many of these discussions took place in the calm environment of the home, the house played a role in shaping decisions that affected entire communities. Even moments of difficulty were faced within these walls. Harsh winters, illness, or poor harvests sometimes brought uncertainty to Viking households. During such periods, the house became a place of protection and resilience. Families relied on the supplies they had stored, the skills they had practiced, and the cooperation they had developed over years of shared living. The same structure that hosted celebrations also sheltered people during their most challenging times. Archaeological research has revealed small but meaningful details about these experiences. For example, worn areas in flooring show where people walked most frequently. Clusters of tools indicate where certain types of work were commonly performed. Layers of ash from hearths show how often fires were maintained and renewed. These quiet traces allow historians to reconstruct the rhythms of life that once filled these buildings. In some locations, entire Viking settlements have been uncovered, revealing groups of houses arranged around shared spaces. These discoveries show that Viking homes were not isolated structures scattered randomly across the landscape. Instead, they often formed organized communities where families supported one another through shared labor and cooperation. Paths connected houses to barns, storage buildings, and nearby fields. Wells or water sources provided fresh water for drinking and cooking. Small workshops might stand close to the main house, where specialized tasks such as metalworking or woodworking could take place. All of these elements together formed a living environment centered on the home. As centuries passed and the Viking Age gradually came to an end, houses in Scandinavia slowly changed in response to new influences. Christianity introduced new cultural traditions, and expanding trade brought contact with other regions of Europe. Architectural styles began to evolve, sometimes incorporating stone foundations or new layouts inspired by continental designs. Yet even as these changes unfolded, the fundamental idea of the house as the center of family life remained constant. The hearth, the shared benches, the workspaces, and the gathering of family members under one roof continued to define daily life in northern communities. Today, when archaeologists carefully uncover the outlines of ancient Viking houses, they are not simply studying buildings. They are rediscovering the spaces where ordinary people lived their lives hundreds of years ago. Every post hole, every fragment of pottery, and every layer of ash tells a small part of that story. And when we picture one of these houses standing against the northern landscape, its roof heavy with turf, its walls sheltering the glow of a fire inside, we begin to understand something important about the Viking world. Behind the legends of voyages and warriors was a quieter reality. Families gathered around a hearth, sharing work, warmth, and the routines of everyday life inside houses built to last. If we continue to imagine life inside one of these Viking houses, it becomes clear that the building was more than a shelter from weather. It acted as a center of stability in a world that could often be unpredictable. Storms could arrive suddenly along the coasts, harvests could vary from year to year, and travel across long distances always carried uncertainty. The house provided a dependable place where life could continue even when the outside world became difficult. One reason Viking houses were so effective at providing this stability was the careful balance between simplicity and strength in their construction. Builders used materials that were available locally: timber, turf, stone, clay, and thatch, but they arranged them in ways that allowed the house to withstand years of use. Thick walls helped protect against wind, while the heavy roof structure distributed weight evenly across the frame. Even though the tools available at the time were simple compared to modern equipment, Viking builders had generations of experience guiding their work. The interior layout also helped maintain comfort in subtle ways. Because the hearth was positioned in the center of the house, heat spread outward gradually through the space. The benches along the walls were slightly raised above the floor, which protected sleeping areas from dampness and cold air that might collect near the ground. Storage chests kept clothing and tools organized while also protecting them from moisture. These practical decisions helped create an environment that could support daily life through harsh seasons. Another interesting feature of Viking houses was how sound traveled within them. Without modern insulation or separate rooms, voices and movements were easily heard throughout the building. Conversations near the hearth might carry softly across the benches, while the sound of someone entering through the doorway could quickly alert everyone inside. This shared acoustic environment reinforced the sense that the household functioned as a single unit. People were rarely isolated from one another, and communication happened naturally throughout the day. Because the house brought people together so closely, cooperation became a natural part of everyday life. Tasks were rarely completed by one person alone. Preparing food, weaving cloth, repairing tools, or organizing supplies often involved several members of the household working together. This cooperation strengthened relationships and ensured that knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Elders in the household often held an important role in this process. Their experience with farming cycles, weather patterns, animal care, and craft skills made them valuable sources of guidance. During quieter moments inside the house, younger members of the family could listen to advice or learn techniques that had been refined over many years. In this way, the house functioned as a place of informal education where practical knowledge was shared continuously. The Viking house also offered protection during times of danger or uncertainty. While most days were focused on routine work, the wider Viking Age was not always peaceful. Conflicts between rival groups, disputes over land, or unexpected travelers could occasionally create tension. In such moments, the solid walls and strong doors of the house provided security. Families could gather inside, protect valuable belongings, and decide how to respond to unfolding events. Yet despite these occasional concerns, most of life inside Viking houses was defined not by conflict but by steady routines. The rhythm of waking, working, preparing meals, caring for animals, and maintaining the home repeated day after day. These routines might appear simple, but they created the structure that allowed Viking communities to endure for centuries. Seasonal celebrations also brought special moments into the house. Festivals connected to agricultural cycles or cultural traditions often involved shared meals, music, and storytelling. During these gatherings, the interior of the house felt warmer and more lively than usual. Food was served in greater quantities, drinks were shared, and guests from nearby farms might join the household. These events reminded people that their lives were part of a wider network of relationships. The objects used during these gatherings, wooden cups, carved bowls, iron cooking pots, were often everyday tools that gained special meaning when used for celebration. Even a simple meal could feel significant when shared among friends and relatives gathered around the same fire. The house, once again, provided the setting where these important moments unfolded. Over long periods of time, these repeated gatherings, conversations, and shared experiences filled the house with memories. Certain benches might become associated with particular family members. A tool hanging near the wall might remind someone of the person who first crafted it. Even the hearth itself, constantly rebuilt with new layers of ash and stone, represented continuity across generations. When archaeologists uncover the remains of Viking houses today, they sometimes find evidence of these long histories in subtle ways. Layers of soil beneath the floor may show repeated rebuilding of hearths. Post holes reveal where earlier walls once stood before repairs or expansions took place. These traces tell us that Viking houses were rarely used for only a short time. Instead, they served as long-lasting homes that adapted as families changed. This sense of continuity helps explain why the Viking house remained such an important symbol of identity. A person's connection to land, family, and community often began within the walls of their home. The house was where children learned the skills that would guide them through adulthood. It was where elders shared memories of earlier times. And it was where the routines of everyday life quietly supported the larger story of the Viking Age. When we look back across history, the dramatic images of ships crossing open seas or warriors standing in distant lands often capture our attention first. But those moments were only possible because of the quieter world that existed inside Viking houses. Within these buildings, families worked patiently, stored their harvests, repaired their tools, and prepared for the future. In the end, the Viking house reminds us that history is not built only from great battles or famous journeys. It is also built from ordinary places where people live their lives, places filled with firelight, shared work, and the steady rhythm of daily life continuing from one season to the next. As we look more closely at Viking houses, another fascinating aspect emerges: how deeply these homes were connected to the natural environment surrounding them. The house did not separate people from nature in the way many modern buildings do. Instead, it formed a kind of middle ground between the outdoor world and the human community living inside. Weather was always present in the daily awareness of the household. The sound of wind pressing against the roof, rain tapping against wooden walls, or snow building along the edges of the structure reminded everyone that the natural world was never far away. Viking houses were strong enough to provide protection, but they were not sealed environments. Small drafts of cold air, changes in light, and the shifting sounds of the landscape constantly filtered through the structure. Because of this closeness to nature, people living in Viking houses developed a strong awareness of seasonal signals. The angle of sunlight entering the doorway, the pattern of frost forming outside, or the changing behavior of animals nearby could all signal the arrival of a new season. These observations were not merely interesting details. They helped families decide when to plant crops, when to preserve food, and when to prepare for colder weather. The placement of the house itself also reflected this relationship with the landscape. Viking builders carefully selected locations that offered practical advantages. Houses were often built on slightly raised ground to avoid flooding, but still close enough to water sources such as rivers, lakes, or the sea. Access to fresh water was essential for drinking, cooking, and cleaning, while nearby forests provided wood for fuel and construction. At the same time, Viking houses were usually positioned to take advantage of natural protection. Hills, trees, or other land formations could shield the structure from strong winds. Orientation toward the sun might help provide additional light and warmth during parts of the year. These decisions reveal how carefully Viking communities studied their surroundings before building their homes. Inside the house, this awareness of the environment continued through the daily management of resources. Firewood had to be gathered and stored carefully so that the hearth could remain active through winter. Water needed to be carried from nearby sources and kept clean for cooking and drinking. Food supplies were organized in ways that protected them from moisture, pests, or spoilage. Even waste from the household was managed thoughtfully. Animal bones, food scraps, and broken materials were often reused whenever possible. Bones might become tools, leather could be repaired and reused, and damaged wooden items might be reshaped into something new. This careful approach to resources helped ensure that nothing valuable was lost. Another element that connected Viking houses to the natural world was the presence of animals. Livestock played an important role in household survival, providing milk, meat, wool, and labor. Depending on the region, animals might be sheltered very close to the main house during colder months. This arrangement helped protect valuable livestock while also contributing a small amount of additional warmth. The sounds and smells of animals therefore became part of everyday life. The low movement of cattle or sheep nearby, the occasional bark of a dog, or the rustle of animals settling into their shelter could all be heard from within the house. For Viking families, these sounds were reassuring reminders that their animals, and therefore their livelihood, were safe nearby. Dogs in particular often lived closely with the household. They could assist with guarding property, herding animals, and alerting the family to visitors approaching the house. Their presence added another layer of connection between the human and animal worlds within the Viking farmstead. As children grew up inside these houses, they became familiar with all of these elements from an early age. The smell of smoke from the hearth, the creaking of wooden beams during storms, and the distant sounds of animals outside were all part of their earliest memories. These sensory experiences helped shape how people understood their environment and their place within it. For many Viking families, the house represented safety not only from weather but also from uncertainty. When darkness fell across the northern landscape, the warm glow of the hearth provided comfort. The thick walls and sturdy roof created a sense of protection, even when storms moved across the countryside outside. This sense of safety was especially important during the long winters when daylight hours were short. Inside the house, the firelight created a warm circle where people could gather together. Stories were shared, tools were repaired, and plans were made for the future. In these moments, the house became more than a structure. It became the emotional center of the household. Archaeologists sometimes describe Viking houses as living spaces of continuity, meaning that they supported life across many years without dramatic changes. Unlike castles or monumental buildings designed to impress visitors, Viking houses focused on reliability and practicality. Their purpose was to support everyday life steadily year after year. Over time, this steady reliability helped create strong communities. When each household could depend on its home for protection, warmth, and organization, families could focus on cooperation with neighbors, trade with distant regions, and exploration beyond their immediate surroundings. In this way, the Viking house quietly supported the larger achievements of the Viking Age. The ships that sailed across oceans were built by people who first learned their skills at home. The traders who traveled to distant markets carried goods produced within households like these. Even the leaders who organized expeditions grew up around hearths inside houses very much like the ones archaeologists uncover today. So while the Viking Age is often remembered for dramatic journeys and powerful warriors, the deeper story begins somewhere far quieter. It begins in houses built from timber and turf, standing against the northern wind, where families gathered around a fire and lived their lives one careful day at a time. As we come closer to the end of our look inside Viking houses, it becomes clear that these buildings tell a story far deeper than their simple appearance might suggest. At first glance, a Viking longhouse may seem modest compared with the stone castles or large cities that came later in European history. Yet within these timber frames and turf-covered roofs existed a complete world of daily activity, social structure, and quiet resilience. One of the most striking things about Viking houses is how effectively they balanced practicality with community life. Every feature served multiple purposes. The hearth warmed the house, cooked food, and provided light. The benches functioned as seating by day and sleeping places by night. Storage chests held tools, clothing, and valuable goods while also helping organize the limited interior space. Nothing existed purely for decoration. Each element contributed to the survival and stability of the household. But beyond these practical functions, the house also shaped the relationships between the people who lived there. Because the interior space was shared so closely, daily life required patience, cooperation, and awareness of others. Families learned to work together naturally. Tasks were distributed according to skill and responsibility, and everyone understood how their efforts contributed to the well-being of the group. This shared living environment also created a strong sense of belonging. Members of the household spent most of their time within the same space, seeing one another through every stage of daily life. They worked together, ate together, rested together, and faced challenges together. The house became a physical expression of family unity, reinforcing the bonds that held Viking society together. The design of the house also encouraged communication. With few internal walls and no separate rooms in the modern sense, conversations flowed easily across the interior. Decisions about farming, travel, trade, or household planning were often discussed openly around the hearth. Younger members of the family could listen and learn while older members shared their experience. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next in this environment. Visitors entering a Viking house would immediately become part of this shared space. Hospitality was deeply valued in Norse culture, and guests were often welcomed with warmth and generosity. Even if supplies were limited, offering food and shelter demonstrated respect and strengthened social ties between families and communities. A traveler sitting near the hearth might share news from distant settlements, bringing stories and information that connected the household to the wider world. These moments of hospitality remind us that Viking houses were not isolated structures hidden across the landscape. They were connected to networks of farms, trade routes, and neighboring communities. Paths between settlements carried travelers, traders, and messengers, while gatherings and feasts reinforced alliances between families. The house stood at the center of these relationships, serving as both private home and social meeting place. Archaeological discoveries have helped historians reconstruct these connections with remarkable detail. Excavated longhouses often appear alongside storage buildings, barns, and workshops, forming small farm complexes. The arrangement of these structures shows how work and domestic life were carefully organized across the landscape. Each building supported a different part of the household economy, while the main house remained the central living space. Inside the house, the rhythm of life followed patterns that repeated across generations. Fires were lit each morning, meals were prepared, tools were repaired, and evening conversations gathered around the glow of the hearth. These routines may seem simple from a modern perspective, but they created stability in a world where survival depended on careful planning and shared effort. Seasonal cycles reinforced this rhythm. The busy months of farming and fishing were balanced by quieter winters spent indoors producing textiles, repairing equipment, and telling stories that preserved cultural memory. Through these repeated patterns, Viking households developed traditions that connected the past with the present. The house also served as a place where important life events unfolded. Births, marriages, celebrations, and moments of grief all occurred within these walls. Generations of families experienced the full range of human life beneath the same roof. Over time, the house itself became a silent witness to these experiences, holding memories that shaped the identity of the family. Even when houses were eventually rebuilt or replaced, the location often remained the same. Families continued to live on the same land, preserving a sense of continuity with those who had come before them. This connection to place helped anchor Viking society in a landscape that could otherwise feel vast and unpredictable. Today, when archaeologists uncover the remains of Viking houses, post holes marking the outlines of walls, hearthstones blackened by centuries-old fires, fragments of tools and pottery, they are uncovering traces of ordinary lives that once filled these spaces. Each discovery adds another piece to the story of how Viking communities actually lived beyond the famous tales of exploration and warfare. Because in truth, the Viking Age was sustained not only by ships and warriors, but by families who managed farms, raised children, and maintained homes like these. The success of long-distance voyages, trade networks, and political alliances all depended on the stability provided by these households. So when we imagine the Viking world now, it may help to picture a quieter scene. A longhouse standing against the northern landscape. Smoke rising slowly from the roof as the hearth burns inside. Voices carrying softly through the wooden interior as a family gathers together after a long day of work. Within that warm circle of firelight, the real foundation of the Viking Age was being built, not through dramatic events, but through the steady, patient routines of life inside a Viking house. And when we step back and look at the Viking house as a whole, we begin to understand that it represented something even larger than the daily routines that filled its interior. It was the foundation of Norse society itself. Everything that defined Viking culture, farming, craftwork, trade, exploration, family loyalty, and community cooperation, began inside structures like these. From childhood onward, the house shaped how people understood the world. A child growing up in a Viking longhouse learned quickly that survival depended on attention, patience, and shared effort. Fire had to be maintained carefully. Food stores had to last through the winter. Tools had to be respected and repaired rather than wasted. These lessons were not taught through formal instruction but through constant participation in household life. As children matured, the house gradually became a place where they prepared for their future roles in society. Young men might begin learning the skills required for farming, fishing, carpentry, or eventually seafaring. Young women developed expertise in textile production, household management, food preparation, and the organization of supplies. These skills were not separate professions in the modern sense. They were essential parts of keeping the household functioning. Because the house demanded cooperation, it also encouraged a strong sense of responsibility. Every member of the household contributed something to the group. Even the smallest tasks mattered. Carrying water, gathering fuel, preparing food, repairing clothing, and tending animals were all part of the same system that allowed the household to endure. Over many years, these shared responsibilities created strong family bonds. Life inside a Viking house meant that people witnessed one another's efforts every day. They saw the work that went into producing food, building tools, and maintaining the home. This closeness reinforced trust and mutual respect within the household. At the same time, the house prepared individuals to interact with the wider community. When members of the household traveled to nearby markets or attended gatherings with neighboring families, they carried with them the values learned at home. Reliability, hospitality, and fairness in trade were qualities that strengthened a person's reputation. A household known for honesty and generosity often gained respect throughout the region. The house also acted as a point of return after journeys or seasonal work. Vikings who traveled for trade or exploration eventually came back to their farms and homes. After months at sea or on distant roads, returning to the familiar warmth of the hearth must have been a powerful experience. The house represented safety, belonging, and continuity in a life that could sometimes involve long and uncertain journeys. For those who remained at home while others traveled, the house carried the responsibility of maintaining stability. Crops still needed attention, animals required care, and supplies had to be managed carefully. The strength of the household allowed the wider Viking world to function. Without strong homes supporting communities, the larger networks of trade and exploration would have struggled to survive. The architecture of Viking houses also reflects this sense of balance between mobility and stability. The longhouse was sturdy and grounded, built to endure harsh weather and years of use. At the same time, the people living within it were often connected to distant regions through trade routes stretching across Europe and beyond. In this way, the Viking house stood firmly in one place while its inhabitants remained linked to a much larger world. Inside these houses, time passed in quiet but meaningful ways. Seasons changed, children grew into adults, and generations followed one another beneath the same roof. The hearth fire burned thousands of times, each flame marking another day of life within the household. These repeated moments formed the real history of the Viking Age. While famous battles and voyages appear in historical records, the steady rhythm of household life continued almost unnoticed. Yet it was this everyday routine that sustained Viking communities for centuries. Archaeologists today often describe Viking houses as some of the most revealing discoveries from the period. Weapons and treasure may attract attention, but houses tell us how ordinary people truly lived. The arrangement of benches, the location of hearths, the tools left behind in the soil, each detail offers a glimpse into the daily experiences of families who lived over 1,000 years ago. Through these discoveries, we can imagine the quiet scenes that once unfolded inside these structures. The glow of firelight reflecting on wooden beams, the sound of spinning wool late in the evening, the smell of fresh bread or simmering stew rising from the hearth. Outside, the northern wind moves across the fields, but inside the house warmth and conversation continue. In the end, the Viking house reminds us that history is not only made by dramatic events or powerful leaders. It is also shaped by the countless ordinary homes where people work, rest, and care for one another. Long before the Viking Age became famous in stories and sagas, it was built day by day inside houses like these. Houses filled with firelight, shared effort, and the quiet determination of families living together at the edge of the northern world. As we reflect further on life inside Viking houses, it becomes clear that these homes also shaped how people understood time itself. Life was not measured by clocks or strict schedules, but by natural cycles and familiar routines repeated day after day. The rising and setting of the sun, the lengthening shadows of evening, and the changing seasons guided the rhythm of life within the household. Morning often began with the quiet revival of the hearth. Someone in the house would rise first, stirring the embers that had been carefully preserved overnight. With a few pieces of fresh wood and a bit of patience, the faint glow of coals would gradually grow into a new fire. As the flames strengthened, the warmth slowly spread across the interior, signaling the beginning of another day. The fire was more than a source of heat. It was the center around which the household awakened. Gradually, the rest of the family would begin to stir. Bedding was folded or moved aside, tools were gathered, and the first simple meal of the day might be prepared. Morning food was usually modest but practical, providing energy for the work ahead. Porridge made from grains, bread baked earlier, or preserved foods from storage could all serve as a quick meal before people moved outside to begin their tasks. Once the day fully began, the house temporarily became quieter. Many household members stepped out to attend to fields, animals, fishing grounds, or nearby work areas. From the outside, the house might appear still, with only thin smoke rising slowly from the roof opening. Yet the structure remained central to everything happening around it. Tools stored inside would soon be used, food prepared within its walls would sustain the workers, and the house itself waited as the gathering point at the end of the day. Inside, some members of the household remained busy with indoor responsibilities. Textile production, food preparation, cleaning, and organizing supplies often continued throughout the day. These tasks were essential for maintaining the household economy. Spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth on large vertical looms, and repairing garments required patience and skill. Each thread spun by hand represented time invested in the household's survival. The house therefore functioned almost like a small workshop as well as a home. Tools and materials were arranged so that work could continue even during poor weather. The central hearth provided light and warmth that made delicate tasks possible during colder months. While outdoor labor was important, the quiet productivity inside the house ensured that clothing, food, and equipment were always ready when needed. As afternoon approached, activity around the house gradually increased again. Workers returned from fields or nearby forests, sometimes carrying bundles of firewood, baskets of gathered plants, or tools that needed cleaning or repair. The doorway once again became a busy place as people moved in and out, bringing the energy of the outside world back into the house. The preparation of the evening meal was one of the most important daily moments. Food was typically cooked in large pots or iron cauldrons suspended above the hearth. Meals often included combinations of grains, vegetables, preserved meat or fish, and dairy products when available. Although the ingredients might be simple, the shared meal brought the entire household together. Eating together served more than just practical needs. It reinforced social bonds and allowed the household to reflect on the day's work. People discussed what had been accomplished, what tasks remained unfinished, and what plans should be made for the following day. These conversations were part of how decisions were made and responsibilities organized. Evening also created space for quieter forms of activity. After the main meal, smaller tasks often continued by the light of the fire. Someone might mend clothing, carve a small wooden tool, or continue spinning wool. Children listened as adults spoke about family history, seasonal plans, or stories passed down from earlier generations. These moments helped preserve the knowledge and traditions that defined Norse culture. Storytelling during these evenings played an especially important role. Without written books available to most people, history and cultural memory were carried through spoken narratives. Stories of ancestors, voyages, heroic deeds, and lessons from the past were shared within the warm circle of firelight. The house became the setting where cultural identity was reinforced again and again. Eventually, as the fire burned lower and fatigue from the day's work set in, the household prepared for sleep. Bedding was arranged along the benches, tools were set aside, and the interior gradually grew quiet. The fire was allowed to fade into glowing embers that would remain alive through the night. Outside, darkness covered the surrounding landscape. Wind might move softly through the fields, and distant animals settled into their shelters. But inside the Viking house, the quiet warmth of the hearth remained, a small center of light and safety within the vast northern night. These repeating cycles of waking, working, gathering, and resting created a steady rhythm that defined life during the Viking Age. The house was the stage on which these rhythms played out every day. Over time, the countless small actions that took place inside its walls, cooking meals, repairing tools, sharing stories, teaching children, formed the deeper history of Viking society. Because when we look beyond the famous images of ships and warriors, we discover that the Viking world was sustained by something much quieter. It was sustained by houses like these, strong, practical homes where families lived together, worked patiently, and kept the fire burning through every season of the northern year. As the years passed, the Viking house also became a place where memory slowly gathered. Every household developed its own history within the walls of the Longhouse. Certain spots inside the home would become associated with particular people or events. A place along the bench where a grandparent once sat, a tool that had belonged to an earlier generation, or a chest that had stored family belongings for decades. All of these objects and locations carried meaning for those who lived there. In a society where written records were limited, memory was preserved through these familiar spaces. The house itself helped keep the past alive. When children grew older and took on more responsibilities, they did so in the same environment where their parents and grandparents had once worked. The beams overhead, the hearth in the center, and the benches along the walls remained constant even as generations changed. This continuity created a deep sense of belonging to place. For many Viking families, the farm and the house were inseparable from their identity. Land passed through inheritance, and maintaining the family home was part of honoring earlier generations. When repairs were made or new structures were built nearby, the work often respected the layout of earlier buildings, preserving the connection between past and present. The house was also where many of life's most important moments occurred. Births took place within its walls, surrounded by family members who offered support and guidance. Celebrations marked marriages and alliances between households. Even during difficult times, such as illness or the loss of a family member, the house remained the space where people gathered together to face those moments collectively. These shared experiences strengthened the emotional bonds within the household. Living in close quarters meant that individuals rarely faced challenges alone. The cooperation required for daily survival extended naturally into emotional support as well. In this way, the Viking house functioned not only as a physical shelter but also as a center of community within the family. Over time, the Longhouse itself aged alongside the people who lived there. Wood darkened from years of smoke rising from the hearth. The floor became worn in the places where footsteps passed most often. Roof materials needed replacement, and beams occasionally required reinforcement. These repairs were part of the normal life of the building, and maintaining the structure was a shared responsibility. When a house finally became too worn to repair, families often constructed a new building very close to the original site. Archaeological excavations sometimes reveal multiple layers of longhouses built on the same piece of land over many decades. Each new structure carried forward the traditions of the earlier one while adapting slightly to new needs or improved building methods. Through these cycles of repair and rebuilding, Viking houses reflected the resilience of the communities that created them. The buildings were not monuments meant to stand unchanged forever. Instead, They were living structures that adapted as families grew, technologies improved, and circumstances shifted. Another remarkable feature of these houses was how they balanced simplicity with remarkable effectiveness. By modern standards, the materials used in Viking construction might appear basic. Yet the design of the longhouse allowed it to endure strong winds, heavy snowfall, and cold temperatures year after year. The thick walls provided insulation, the steep roof helped shed rain and snow, and the central hearth ensured a reliable source of warmth. This practical design was the result of generations of accumulated knowledge. Viking builders understood their environment deeply, and they used that understanding to create homes that suited the demands of northern climates. The longhouse was not simply a shelter. It was a carefully developed solution to the challenges of living in Scandinavia. As Viking society expanded through trade, exploration, and settlement, the idea of the longhouse traveled with it. Norse settlers carried their building traditions to places like Iceland, Greenland, and parts of the British Isles. Although materials varied depending on the local environment, the overall structure remained familiar. The central hearth, long interior space, and shared living areas continued to define Norse homes far from Scandinavia. In these distant settlements, the house once again became the starting point for community life. Families arriving in new lands relied on their homes to create stability in unfamiliar surroundings. The same patterns of daily work, cooking, weaving, repairing tools, caring for animals, continued in these new locations just as they had in the Scandinavian homelands. Because of this, Viking houses played an essential role in the spread of Norse culture. They carried not only architectural traditions but also social practices and ways of organizing daily life. Wherever Norse settlers traveled, the structure of the household remained remarkably consistent. Today, when archaeologists uncover the remains of these longhouses, they are uncovering the foundations of entire communities. The outlines of walls, the remains of hearths, and the objects left behind inside these buildings reveal how people organized their lives thousands of days in a row. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding of the Viking world. And when we imagine standing inside one of these houses long ago, we can begin to picture the quiet strength that defined them. The fire glows steadily in the center of the room. The smell of smoke drifts upward toward the roof. Outside, the northern wind moves across fields and forests, but inside the house warmth and life continue. In many ways, this image captures the true heart of the Viking Age. Behind every voyage across the sea and every story recorded in the sagas stood countless households like this one. Houses where families gathered around the hearth, shared their work, and built the foundations of a society that would leave a lasting mark on history. As we move toward the final moments inside a Viking house, it becomes easier to see that these buildings were more than practical shelters or simple farm structures. They represented the quiet center of a society that balanced endurance, cooperation, and adaptability. Within their timber frames, Viking families created a stable world that allowed them to face the uncertainties of climate, travel, and survival. One of the most powerful aspects of the Viking house was the sense of continuity it offered. Generations often lived in the same location, sometimes rebuilding new structures directly over the foundations of older ones. This meant that the land and the house became deeply tied to family identity. A person did not simply live in a house. They inherited a place within a long chain of people who had lived, worked, and gathered around the same hearth. For the people of the Viking Age, this connection to home was meaningful in ways that shaped their entire worldview. The house was where children first learned how the world worked. It was where they observed the rhythms of daily labor, the careful use of resources, and the quiet cooperation that allowed a household to survive through long winters. Inside the longhouse, every action carried a sense of purpose. Firewood was stacked carefully because the warmth of the hearth could not be taken for granted. Food was stored with attention because a failed harvest or harsh winter could quickly test a family's preparation. Tools were repaired rather than replaced because materials required time and effort to obtain. These habits created a culture of patience and resilience. Viking households learned to plan ahead, to respect the limits of their environment, and to support one another through shared responsibility. The house was where these values were practiced every day. At the same time, the Longhouse was not a place of isolation. Even though families spent much of their time within the same building, they were deeply connected to the wider community around them. Paths between farms linked households together, allowing neighbors to visit, exchange goods, and offer assistance when needed. Hospitality played an important role in maintaining these relationships. A traveler arriving at a Viking house could expect shelter and a meal, even if supplies were modest. Sharing food and warmth reinforced bonds between families and helped maintain peace within the community. In a landscape where distances could be great and travel uncertain, this tradition of hospitality carried real importance. The house also served as a meeting place where news traveled from one region to another. A visitor might bring stories of distant markets, changing political alliances, or ships returning from trade journeys across the sea. These conversations allowed even remote households to remain connected to the wider Viking world. Inside the warm circle of the hearth, the outside world felt both distant and present at the same time. The house offered protection from storms and cold, yet it also acted as a gateway through which new ideas and information entered the household. Even the architecture of the Longhouse supported this balance between stability and openness. The building stood firmly against the northern weather, but its doorway remained a place of constant movement. People left for daily work, returned with gathered supplies, welcomed guests, and occasionally prepared for longer journeys. For those who did travel, whether as traders, explorers, or sailors, the memory of home remained powerful. After weeks or months away, returning to the familiar glow of the hearth must have carried a sense of deep relief. The house represented safety, belonging, and the continuity of family life. Meanwhile, those who remained at home ensured that the household continued to function. Crops were tended, animals cared for, and supplies maintained. The stability of the house made it possible for others to travel outward with confidence that their home would still be waiting when they returned. In this way, the Viking house quietly supported the wider achievements of the Viking Age. Ships may have carried Norse sailors across vast oceans, but those journeys began and ended in homes like these. The skills required for shipbuilding, navigation, and trade were first learned within the routines of household life. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal just how central these houses were to Viking society. The remains of hearths, the layout of benches, the placement of tools and weaving equipment. All of these details show how carefully the interior space was organized. Even small fragments of pottery or metal found within longhouses help historians understand the patterns of everyday life. Through these discoveries, we gain a clearer picture of the Viking world as it was truly lived. It was not only a world of dramatic voyages or legendary battles. It was also a world of quiet mornings, shared meals, patient craftwork, and evenings spent beside the fire. And perhaps that is the most meaningful insight of all. When we imagine the Viking Age today, it is easy to picture longships cutting through dark waters or warriors standing on distant shores. But behind every expedition and every legend stood thousands of ordinary households. Inside their houses, Viking families lit fires, prepared food, repaired tools, and told stories that carried their culture forward. They endured long winters, celebrated good harvests, and taught their children the skills needed to survive in a demanding environment. So if we could stand quietly inside a Viking longhouse at the end of the day, we would see something simple yet powerful. A fire glowing at the center of the room, the steady murmur of conversation, and a family gathered together beneath a roof built by their own hands. It was within spaces like these, warm against the northern cold, that the true heart of the Viking world quietly endured. If we pause for a moment and imagine the final hours of an ordinary day in a Viking house, the scene becomes surprisingly peaceful. Outside, the northern landscape slowly darkens. The wind moves across fields and forests, and the sky fades into long evening shadows. But inside the longhouse, the fire continues to glow at the center of the room, filling the air with a warm orange light that flickers softly across wooden beams and worn benches. The day's work has mostly come to an end. Tools have been set aside, animals have been secured, and the evening meal has already been shared. What remains is a quieter part of the evening, when the household settles into a slower rhythm. Someone might still be turning a spindle gently, twisting wool into thread with patient movements learned over many years. Another person might sit near the hearth repairing a tool handle or smoothing a wooden object that will be used again tomorrow. Children, who have spent the day running between indoor chores and outdoor tasks, grow quieter as fatigue catches up with them. Some sit close to the fire, listening as the older members of the household speak. Others may already be resting along the benches, wrapped in blankets or furs that protect them from the cooler air drifting through the longhouse. Conversation during these evenings often moves easily between practical matters and shared memories. Someone might talk about the coming season, when planting should begin, or whether more firewood should be gathered before winter grows colder. Another person might recall a journey taken years before, describing distant lands or unfamiliar markets where Norse traders once traveled. These stories are not told merely for entertainment. In a society where written records were rare, spoken memory carried great importance. Knowledge about the land, the sea, and the experiences of earlier generations was passed along through careful storytelling. Around the fire, young listeners absorbed these lessons without realizing that they were learning the foundations of their culture. As the fire burns lower, shadows grow longer along the interior walls. The smoke rising toward the roof slowly escapes through openings above, leaving behind the familiar scent of wood and ash that filled Viking homes night after night. This smell, mixed with the warmth of the hearth and the quiet voices of family members, formed the atmosphere that many Vikings would remember throughout their lives. Eventually, the household prepares for sleep. Bedding made from wool, straw, or animal furs is arranged along the benches. Tools are stored safely for the night, and valuable items are placed inside wooden chests. The final task before rest often involves tending the hearth one last time. Fresh wood might be added briefly before the fire is allowed to settle into glowing embers. These embers are important. Completely extinguishing the fire would make it difficult to restart in the morning, especially during cold weather. Instead, the household allows the coals to remain alive beneath a layer of ash. In the early morning, someone will stir them gently and bring the flame back to life. Gradually, the house grows quiet. One by one, the voices fade, replaced by the soft crackle of the dying fire and the distant sounds of the night outside. The longhouse, which only hours earlier was filled with movement and conversation, now becomes a calm place of rest. Yet even in this quiet, the house continues to serve its purpose. Its walls block the cold wind sweeping across the landscape. Its roof protects the family beneath it from rain or snow, and the remaining warmth of the hearth keeps the interior comfortable enough for sleep. For the people living inside, this nightly sense of security was deeply important. Life in the Viking Age involved constant awareness of nature's power: storms, freezing winters, and unpredictable seasons. The house represented a place where those challenges could be held at a distance, at least for a while. Morning will come soon enough. The first person to wake will stir the embers, rekindling the fire. Light will slowly return through the doorway, and the routines of another day will begin once again. Food will be prepared, tools will be gathered, and people will step outside to continue the work that sustains the household. These cycles repeated thousands of times across the Viking world. From Norway's fjords to the farms of Denmark, from Iceland's rugged landscapes to Norse settlements across the North Atlantic, houses like these formed the quiet backbone of society. When historians and archaeologists study Viking culture today, it is easy to focus on the dramatic elements, the ships, the raids, the exploration of distant lands. But the deeper truth of the Viking Age lies within these homes. Inside longhouses, ordinary people built lives through cooperation, patience, and careful use of the resources around them. They raised families, preserved knowledge, and maintained the stability that allowed their society to grow and travel far beyond its northern origins. So when we imagine the Viking world now, it may be worth picturing one final scene. A longhouse standing against the cold northern night, smoke drifting slowly from the roof into the dark sky. Inside, the last embers of the hearth glowing softly as a family sleeps nearby. It is a quiet image, but within that quiet warmth, the real story of the Viking Age was unfolding, one ordinary evening at a time. And if we linger just a little longer inside this Viking house, In the quiet hours before dawn, we begin to see something that historians often emphasize. The Viking world was built not only through bold action, but through extraordinary consistency. The routines repeated inside these homes, day after day, season after season, created the stability that made exploration, trade, and expansion possible. Long before ships were pushed into cold northern waters, someone inside a house like this had already prepared the ropes, woven the sails, repaired the tools, and stored the food that would sustain the journey. Every expedition that later appeared in sagas or historical records began in places exactly like this, by the firelight of a longhouse. And so, while the great voyages of the Viking Age often capture the imagination, the truth is that most Vikings lived lives centered around the home. Their world revolved around farms, families, and houses that stood firmly against the demanding climate of the north. These houses were not grand by the standards of later centuries. They were built from timber, turf, clay, and thatch materials taken directly from the surrounding landscape. Yet their design showed remarkable understanding of the environment. The curved walls helped deflect strong winds. Thick layers of turf provided insulation. The central hearth distributed warmth through the entire interior. Over generations, these building techniques were refined and passed down just like other skills within the household. A young person growing up in a Viking home did not simply learn how to work the land or care for animals. They also learned how a house itself should be maintained. Roofs had to be repaired after heavy storms. Wooden beams needed strengthening as they aged. Turf walls required occasional rebuilding. These tasks were part of the yearly rhythm of life. Maintaining the house was as essential as maintaining the fields. Because of this, Viking houses were rarely abandoned without reason. When a structure became too worn to repair, families often rebuilt on the same site. Archaeologists frequently discover several generations of longhouses layered within the same location, each one replacing the previous building while preserving the connection to the land. This pattern reveals something deeply important about Viking culture. Continuity mattered. Families valued the places where their ancestors had lived. The house was not just a structure. It was part of a family's story. Inside the house, everyday objects quietly reflected this sense of continuity as well. Tools were used for many years, often repaired again and again. A knife might pass from parent to child. A wooden chest might hold belongings across several generations. Even the hearth itself was rebuilt repeatedly in the same place, its stones darkened by centuries of smoke. These small details created a feeling of permanence within the home. While the outside world could change, political alliances shifting, trade routes expanding, new settlements appearing across distant shores, the house remained a stable center of life. And within that stable center, the Viking household operated almost like a carefully balanced system. Every member had a role that contributed to the whole. Women managed the household economy, overseeing food preparation, textile production, and storage of supplies. Their responsibilities were central to the survival of the family, particularly during the long winters when careful planning made the difference between comfort and hardship. Men contributed through farming, fishing, construction, and travel connected to trade or exploration. Yet even these outward-facing activities were rooted in the home. Tools were made or repaired inside the house. Food supplies were organized there. Decisions about journeys or agreements with neighbors were often discussed around the hearth. Children grew up observing all of this. From a young age, they participated in small tasks, carrying water, collecting firewood, helping with animals. Gradually, they learned the skills necessary to sustain a household of their own one day. In this way, the Viking house functioned as both home and school. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next not through formal instruction, but through everyday participation. Another important feature of life inside these houses was the constant presence of community values. Reputation mattered greatly in Norse society. A household known for fairness in trade, reliability in agreements, and generosity toward guests earned respect among neighbors. Hospitality, in particular, was deeply tied to the house itself. Travelers moving through the Scandinavian countryside depended on the willingness of households to offer shelter and food. Refusing hospitality could damage a family's standing within the community. Because of this, the Viking house was always prepared, at least in a modest way, to receive guests. Even a small household might set aside a place near the hearth for a traveler who arrived after a long journey. When guests visited, the atmosphere inside the house changed slightly. Stories were exchanged. News from distant regions traveled from person to person. Trade opportunities might be discussed, and plans for future journeys could begin to take shape. Through these conversations, even households far from major towns remained connected to the wider Viking world. And so, the house acted as a bridge between two different realities. On one hand, it was a deeply personal space where families lived their daily lives. On the other hand, it was a point of connection linking individuals to communities, trade networks, and distant lands. When we consider all of this together, the Viking house begins to appear less like a simple rural building and more like the heart of an entire society. Within its walls, people prepared for winter, taught their children essential skills, welcomed travelers, repaired tools, shared stories, and made plans that sometimes reached far beyond their immediate surroundings. The quiet strength of these houses allowed Viking communities to endure through centuries of change. So when we picture the Viking Age now, perhaps we should imagine not only ships crossing the open sea, but also scenes like this: a longhouse standing against the northern wind. Inside, a fire burns steadily in the hearth. Someone spins wool by the firelight. Another repairs a wooden tool that will be needed tomorrow. Children listen quietly as stories of distant voyages are told. Beyond the walls, the world may be vast and uncertain. But within the warmth of the house, life continues. Steady, patient, and deeply connected to the rhythms of land, family, and tradition. And it was from these houses, filled with ordinary moments like these, that the remarkable story of the Viking Age truly began. And if we stay a little longer with this image of the Viking house, we begin to understand something even more profound about it. The Longhouse was not simply the place where Viking life happened. It was the structure that quietly shaped how that life unfolded. Its design encouraged cooperation, its shared spaces strengthened family bonds, and its steady warmth created a center around which an entire culture organized itself. Unlike many modern homes, which divide space into separate rooms for different individuals, the Viking house was intentionally communal. The open interior meant that daily life unfolded in view of everyone else. Work, conversation, rest, and learning all happened within the same shared environment. Because of this, the house created a constant sense of togetherness. This togetherness was essential in a world where survival depended on collective effort. A household that worked well together could endure harsh winters, failed harvests, or unexpected challenges. But a household divided by conflict or poor cooperation would struggle. The house itself reinforced unity by bringing everyone together around the same fire. The hearth, sitting at the center of the longhouse, symbolized more than warmth and cooking. It represented continuity and life itself. As long as the fire continued to burn, the household remained active and secure. The act of tending the hearth, feeding it with wood, keeping the coals alive overnight, protecting it from strong drafts, became a daily ritual repeated countless times throughout the year. Over time, the hearth accumulated layers of ash and stone, quietly marking the passage of years. Archaeologists often discover these layers during excavations, each one representing thousands of meals prepared and countless evenings spent gathered nearby. Through these traces, the hearth becomes one of the most powerful symbols of Viking domestic life. Around the hearth, the arrangement of benches created a subtle social order within the house. The head of the household typically occupied a place of honor along the central area of the hall. Family members, workers, and guests would take their places according to status, age, or role within the household. This arrangement was rarely spoken about directly, yet everyone understood it. These seating patterns reflected the broader structure of Viking society. Authority within the household mirrored authority within the community. Leadership was demonstrated not through distant commands but through visible presence within shared spaces. The house therefore became a small reflection of the larger social world. Despite this structure, the atmosphere inside the longhouse was rarely rigid. Daily life still required flexibility. Children moved between adults, learning tasks, and helping where they could. Visitors were welcomed into the shared space. Work areas shifted depending on what needed to be done that day. The house balanced structure with adaptability, allowing it to function smoothly through changing circumstances. Another important aspect of Viking houses was the constant presence of craftwork. Many of the objects used in everyday life were created or maintained within the home itself. Wooden tools, leather goods, woven cloth, and repaired metal items all emerged from patient work carried out near the hearth. Textile production in particular occupied a central place in household life. Spinning wool into thread and weaving it into fabric required long hours of careful attention. Looms often stood near the walls of the longhouse, their weighted threads hanging vertically while weavers worked steadily across them. The quiet rhythm of weaving became a familiar sound within the house. Cloth produced in this way served many purposes. It provided clothing for the household, blankets for warmth, and sometimes goods for trade. In some parts of the Viking world, textiles even functioned as a form of wealth or currency. The work carried out inside the house therefore supported both daily survival and broader economic activity. Food preparation also filled much of the indoor activity. Large iron cauldrons suspended over the hearth allowed families to prepare meals that could feed many people at once. Stews made from grains, vegetables, fish, or preserved meats were common, offering nourishment after long hours of labor. Preparing these meals required careful management of supplies. The success of autumn harvests determined how comfortably a family would pass through the winter months. Inside the house, food storage areas were organized with great attention. Barrels, chests, and hanging racks kept supplies protected from moisture and pests. Because of this careful planning, the Viking house functioned almost like a living storehouse. Every object within it, every tool, piece of cloth, or stored food item, represented hours of labor and valuable resources. Waste was minimized whenever possible. Broken objects were repaired. Worn clothing was patched. Even bones and scraps could be reused for tools or other purposes. This culture of careful use shaped the mindset of Viking households. People learned to respect the effort behind every object and every meal. The house reinforced this awareness by keeping daily labor visible to everyone who lived within it. As evening returned each day, the house slowly shifted from a place of work into a place of reflection. The firelight softened the interior, and the steady hum of activity quieted. Conversations turned toward stories, plans, and shared memories. Children listened as elders spoke about earlier times, about distant journeys, difficult winters, or the deeds of ancestors. These stories carried more than entertainment. They preserved the values of the community. Courage, loyalty, fairness, and respect for family were all reinforced through the narratives shared around the hearth. Through storytelling, the house became a place where culture itself was preserved and passed forward. And so, when we imagine the Viking house in its fullest sense, we should not picture a silent wooden structure standing alone in the landscape. Instead, we should imagine a living space filled with movement, sound, and warmth. The crackle of the fire, the quiet rhythm of weaving, the murmur of voices sharing stories late into the evening. Outside, the vast northern world stretches across forests, mountains, and open seas. But inside the longhouse, life continues in a steady circle around the hearth. A circle of family, work, memory, and resilience. And it was within these humble yet enduring homes that the true strength of the Viking world quietly lived. And as we reach the final moments of our journey inside a Viking house, it helps to step back and see the full picture these homes reveal. The Longhouse was not only a place where people lived, it was the quiet engine that powered the entire Viking world. Behind every voyage, every trade network, and every legendary story recorded in later sagas stood households like these, steady and enduring. From the outside, a Viking house might have appeared simple. A low structure with a sloping roof, often covered in turf or thatch, blending into the landscape rather than rising above it. Smoke drifted slowly from an opening along the roofline, carried away by the wind across fields or coastal hills. Travelers passing in the distance might see little more than a modest farmstead surrounded by grazing animals and scattered buildings. But stepping inside revealed a completely different world. The interior of a longhouse was alive with activity. Firelight flickered across timber beams darkened by years of smoke. Benches lined the walls, layered with furs and woven cloth. Wooden chests held tools, garments, and carefully stored household goods. Near one wall, a loom might stand quietly, its threads waiting for the next day's weaving. At the center of it all burned the hearth. The hearth was more than a cooking fire, it was the heart of the household. It provided warmth during the cold northern winters, light during the long evenings, and a gathering point that brought everyone together. Around this fire, meals were shared, tools were repaired, and stories were told. This shared space created a strong sense of unity within the household. Life inside a Viking house was rarely private in the modern sense. People worked, spoke, and rested in close proximity to one another. Every member of the household saw the effort required to keep the home functioning. Every task, from chopping wood to spinning wool, was visible to others. Because of this, cooperation became a natural part of daily life. Children grew up watching the steady work of their parents and grandparents. They learned by participating, first with small tasks like gathering kindling or carrying water, and later with more complex responsibilities. By the time they reached adulthood, they understood the rhythms of household life because they had been part of it since childhood. In this way, the Viking house functioned as a place of learning as much as a place of shelter. Knowledge about farming, crafting tools, managing food supplies, and surviving harsh weather passed naturally from one generation to the next. No written instructions were needed. The house itself was the classroom, and daily life was the lesson. The house also served as a place where social relationships were reinforced. Guests arriving from nearby settlements or distant journeys were welcomed into the shared space around the hearth. Offering food and shelter was not simply kindness. It was a deeply valued tradition in Norse culture. A traveler who arrived at dusk might step through the doorway into the warmth of the longhouse, greeted by the glow of firelight and the quiet murmur of conversation. Soon a place would be made along the bench, and a bowl of food would be passed across the fire. In return, the guest often brought news. Stories of distant markets, unfamiliar lands, political disputes, or successful voyages spread from household to household in this way. Even families living far from major towns remained connected to the wider Viking world through these conversations. Inside the house, the outside world felt both distant and present at the same time. And yet, despite these connections, most Viking lives remained centered firmly on the home and the land surrounding it. Fields needed tending, animals required care, and supplies had to be prepared carefully for winter. The success of the household depended on the ability to manage these responsibilities with patience and foresight. Autumn harvests were stored carefully inside the house and nearby buildings. Barrels of preserved food, sacks of grain, and bundles of dried fish or meat represented months of preparation. The house protected these supplies through the long winter months when fresh food became scarce. During those winters, the house became even more important. Snow and darkness often kept people indoors for long periods of time. Yet the longhouse was designed precisely for this situation. The central hearth provided warmth, the benches offered places for work and rest, and the shared space allowed families to remain productive even when storms raged outside. Winter evenings were filled with quieter activities: spinning wool, weaving cloth, repairing tools, or preparing items for the coming spring. Storytelling flourished during these months as well. Around the hearth, elders passed down stories of ancestors, distant travels, and legendary heroes whose deeds were remembered long after they were gone. These stories helped shape the identity of Viking culture. They reminded listeners of courage, loyalty, and resilience. They connected young generations to the experiences of those who came before them, and they reinforced the idea that every household was part of a larger tradition stretching back through time. The house itself became part of that tradition. Over decades, the Longhouse absorbed the memories of those who lived there. The worn floor marked the footsteps of generations. The beams overhead carried the smoke of countless fires. The hearthstones were blackened by years of meals shared among family and guests. When a house eventually became too old to repair, families often built a new structure nearby, sometimes directly on the same site. In this way, the location of the home remained constant even as the building itself changed. Archaeologists frequently uncover layers of longhouses built one above another, each representing a new generation continuing life in the same place. These discoveries reveal just how important the home was in maintaining continuity across centuries. And so, when we think about the Viking Age today, it is easy to focus on its most dramatic elements. Ships crossing stormy seas, warriors appearing on distant shores, traders traveling across continents. But the deeper story lies somewhere quieter. It lies inside houses like these. Inside a longhouse, a family gathers at the end of the day. The fire burns softly in the hearth. Someone finishes weaving the final threads of a piece of cloth. Another sharpens a tool that will be needed tomorrow. Children listen as stories are told about the past. Outside, the northern night stretches across the land. But inside the Viking house, warmth and life continue. And within that circle of firelight, through ordinary work, shared responsibility, and steady routines, the true foundation of the Viking world was built, one day at a time. And if we take one final step back from the hearth and look at the Viking house not just as a building, but as a symbol, its importance becomes even clearer. These longhouses represented the core of stability in a world that was often unpredictable. The Viking Age is remembered for movement, ships traveling across open seas, traders crossing continents, settlers establishing new communities in distant lands. Yet for most people, life was rooted firmly in one place. And that place was home. The Viking house grounded people in the land around them. The fields outside were not simply property. They were the source of survival. Grain grown in nearby soil became the bread and porridge eaten each morning. Animals grazing in surrounding pastures provided milk, wool, leather, and meat. Forests nearby supplied timber for construction and firewood for warmth. The house stood at the center of this entire system, linking land, labor, and family together. Every season shaped the life inside the house in a slightly different way. Spring brought the first busy movements outdoors as fields were prepared and animals were tended. Summer filled the days with long hours of work under the northern sun. Autumn demanded careful harvesting and preservation of food. And winter drew everyone back into the longhouse, where warmth and cooperation became essential. These cycles repeated year after year, giving Viking households a steady rhythm that connected them closely to the natural world. Unlike modern life, where artificial light and technology separate people from the seasons, Viking families experienced each change in weather and daylight directly. The house did not isolate them from nature. It simply provided a protective center within it. Inside, the structure of daily life reinforced this connection. The hearth reminded everyone of the importance of fire and fuel. Storage chests reflected the value of careful preparation. The shared sleeping spaces reminded family members that they depended on one another. Even the architecture of the house revealed this philosophy. The longhouse was wide enough to accommodate many people but narrow enough that the warmth of the fire could reach every corner. The roof was steep and strong, designed to shed rain and snow. Thick walls insulated the interior while still allowing smoke to escape slowly through openings above. Nothing about the design was accidental. Every detail had been shaped by generations of experience living in the same northern landscapes. Because of this accumulated knowledge, Viking houses were remarkably well-suited to their environment. They were not temporary shelters built quickly and abandoned easily. They were homes intended to last for decades, sometimes for the lifetimes of several generations. Within those decades, the house witnessed countless moments of ordinary life. Morning fires being lit before sunrise, meals shared after long days in the fields, children taking their first steps across the wooden floor, elders telling stories that carried the memory of earlier generations. These moments rarely appear in written history, but they formed the true substance of Viking society. Archaeologists often emphasize this point when discussing Viking houses. Weapons and treasure can tell us about conflict and wealth, but houses tell us about people. The layout of a longhouse reveals how families organized their space. The tools left behind show what work was performed each day. The remains of food and animal bones reveal what people ate and how they managed their resources. Through these discoveries, the Viking world becomes less distant and more human. We can imagine the quiet sounds of daily life inside the house, the scraping of a knife shaping wood, the soft rhythm of a loom as cloth is woven, the murmur of voices sharing news from neighboring farms, the steady crackle of the hearth fire that never seemed to go out for long. In this way, the Viking house becomes a window into the everyday lives of people who lived more than 1,000 years ago. And perhaps the most surprising realization is that, in many ways, their concerns were not so different from our own. They worried about food supplies, about protecting their families, about preparing for the future. They worked hard, relied on one another, and sought comfort in the familiar warmth of home after long days of labor. The difference was the environment in which they lived. The northern landscapes of Scandinavia demanded resilience and careful planning. Life could be harsh if preparations failed. But within the shelter of the longhouse, families created a place where warmth, cooperation, and stability could flourish despite those challenges. So when we imagine the Viking Age now, it may help to shift our focus slightly. Instead of picturing only ships cutting across cold oceans or warriors appearing on distant shores, we might picture something quieter but just as powerful. A longhouse stands against the northern wind, its turf-covered roof blending into the surrounding land. Smoke rises slowly into the evening sky. Inside, the fire burns steadily at the center of the room. Around that fire sit the people who truly shaped the Viking world. Families sharing food, repairing tools, weaving cloth, and telling stories that carry their traditions forward. The outside world may be vast and uncertain, filled with distant horizons and unknown journeys. But inside the Viking house, life continues steadily, anchored by the warmth of the hearth and the quiet strength of the household. And it was within these humble yet enduring homes that the Viking Age found its true foundation: one fire, one family, and one longhouse at a time. And so, as our time inside the Viking house comes to an end, it helps to pause for a moment and consider what these quiet spaces truly represent. When most people think of the Viking Age, their minds often go immediately to dramatic images. Longships cutting through dark seas, warriors standing on distant shores, or traders traveling across continents. Those moments certainly happened, and they remain an important part of history. But the deeper story of the Viking world lived somewhere far more ordinary. It lived inside houses like this. Within the timber frames and turf-covered roofs of Viking longhouses, families built the foundation of their entire society. These homes were places of warmth in a cold climate, places of learning in a world without formal schools, and places of cooperation in a landscape where survival depended on shared effort. Every day began and ended around the hearth. In the morning, someone stirred the embers that had been carefully protected through the night. Flames rose slowly again, spreading warmth through the house as the household prepared for another day. Meals were cooked, tools gathered, and plans discussed before people stepped outside to begin their work. By evening, those same people returned through the doorway carrying the results of their labor: bundles of wood, tools that needed repair, baskets of food, or simply the tired satisfaction of a day's effort. The fire was fed again, and the house slowly filled with quiet conversation. Over time, these repeated moments formed the true rhythm of Viking life. Inside the longhouse, children learned the skills that would guide them through adulthood. They watched how tools were maintained, how food was prepared, and how resources were carefully managed. They listened to stories told by elders, stories of earlier winters, distant voyages, and ancestors whose lives were remembered through spoken memory. Those stories carried the values of Viking culture: courage, resilience, loyalty to family, and respect for the land that sustained them. The house itself helped preserve those values. Because everyone lived so closely together, daily life encouraged cooperation. Work was shared, responsibilities were understood, and the success of the household depended on each person contributing in their own way. The Longhouse created an environment where these lessons were learned naturally through experience. It was also a place of welcome. Travelers arriving from nearby farms or distant settlements could find shelter beside the same hearth where the family gathered each evening. Hospitality was an important tradition in Norse society, and offering food and warmth to a guest strengthened the bonds between households. When visitors arrived, they often brought news, stories of markets, ships returning from trade routes, or events unfolding in other regions. In this way, even a quiet farmstead remained connected to the wider Viking world. Yet despite these connections, most Viking lives remained centered on the home. Fields needed tending, animals required care, and food had to be prepared carefully for the long winters ahead. The success of the household depended not on heroic moments, but on steady effort repeated day after day. Over the years, the house itself became part of the family's story. The floor grew worn where generations had walked. The beams overhead darkened from years of hearth smoke. The stones of the fireplace carried the marks of countless meals and evenings spent gathered nearby. When a house eventually became too old to repair, families often built another in the same place. Archaeologists today sometimes discover several longhouses layered within the same site, each representing a new generation continuing life where their ancestors once lived. This continuity reveals something important about the Viking world. While ships traveled far and new settlements appeared across the North Atlantic, the heart of Viking society remained rooted in the stability of home. These houses provided the security that allowed exploration, trade, and expansion to happen in the first place. Without the steady rhythm of life inside the longhouse, without the careful storage of food, the weaving of cloth, the repair of tools, and the teaching of children, the larger achievements of the Viking Age would not have been possible. In that sense, the Longhouse was more than a building. It was the quiet center of a civilization. So when we imagine the Viking Age now, it may help to picture one final scene. A longhouse stands against the northern landscape as evening settles across the fields. The wind moves gently through the grass, and the sky fades into the deep colors of night. From the roof of the house, a thin line of smoke rises slowly into the cold air. Inside, the fire burns steadily. A family sits together along the benches, finishing the last small tasks of the day. Someone mends a piece of clothing. Another sharpens a tool that will be needed tomorrow. Children listen quietly as stories are told beside the hearth. Outside, the world is vast and uncertain. But within the warmth of the Viking house, life continues. Steady, patient, and deeply connected to family, land, and tradition. And it was inside houses like these, gathered around the quiet glow of the hearth, that the true story of the Viking Age was lived, one ordinary evening at a time.